Hi folks, this is Dakota and Deerwomon. We're back with an update about Deerwoman's experience with treating herself for suspected Lyme disease. She's going to share with you her story about being diagnosed with Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Ehrlichea and some of the symptoms that went with it. And since we've been doing this Lyme series, we've covered how common the co-infections like this are to Lyme itself and how difficult it can be to get a real, true, positive diagnosis that you do indeed have Lyme disease. So she's going to tell you about her experience, and then she took advantage of one of the recommendations that was given in one of our previous Lyme shows on the Lyme protocols. We had a show on Lyme protocols where we really only went into one of the protocols that I thought was very interesting, especially because it's useful for people who suspect they may have Lyme but are unable to verify it and want to do something. So anyway, I'm going to turn this over to Deerwomon to share with you what her experience has been over this last year or so.
Okay, well, thank you, Dakota. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I have a very interesting story, and I had no reason to think I had fever until I started to examine some reoccurring symptoms. What happened was I had a series of symptoms that occurred, and it was in a 5-day period. It started with fever, enough so that I was perspiring, and then I had chills. I had a heaviness in my brow, kind of like a dull, headachy experience. I had aches in my belly, and I had a very consistent nausea. And what happened was, I think this was back may have been in May, I had this occurrence of symptoms, and it lasts 5 days. And while I was in the symptoms, I started to realize I've had these symptoms before, and that they've occurred in exactly that order. And they were the exact symptoms. And I started sitting with that and going, wait a minute. I could recall that in just the past year alone, I had had about 6 episodes of these same symptoms. So when I started to recognize, wait a minute, there's something reoccurring here, that's what started me researching. And of course, I've been working with Dakota all along, and I was aware that people were getting Lyme disease, and I thought, you know what, just for the heck of it, I'm going to go and get some lab work done. And fortunately, I had the assistance of the Echo Clinic here in Eureka Springs. And when I came into the clinic, I wasn't having those symptoms. I had moved through them. I was feeling fairly well. The only thing that I would say that continued with me was I had like a low-grade fatigue, and I felt like my immune system wasn't quite up to par. So sure enough, I went for the lab work, and that's when the test came back, and sure enough, I didn't have Lyme, but I had Ehrlichea was one of them, and I had the Rocky Mountain spotted fever. At the time, they definitely offered the, how do you pronounce that, Dakota, the antibiotic, the
Doxycycline.
Doxycycline. And at this point, I felt like, you know, I was willing to do the antibiotic. I knew that I was going to do some supplement alongside that. And in fact, Dr. Kim Feit in Kansas City, who I've known for years, an acupuncturist, chiropractor, nutritionist, she happened to be in town. And she said, if in fact you do have to go on the antibiotic, she immediately recommended that I do a Chinese herb called ABX, and that would be an antidote to help balance out the antibiotic in my body. Okay, so I was through the phases, and then with doing the further research with you, Dakota, we began to understand that even though when you treat these tick fevers, that there can be a reoccurrence, and there's a typical cycle that might occur in 6 weeks. And so, of course, I was on the antibiotic, so it was knocking everything out. But from what we shared, you had said that ideally the best time for that antibiotic is when you're having the symptoms. Well, it wasn't having the symptoms. We were just knowing that it was in me. So when I had met with Doc Kim, she not only recommended the ABX, she told me that following the antibiotic, she strongly recommended that I do a parasite cleanse, which I did, and it was some prescribed supplements. And then after the parasite cleanse, she said go into an herb called Zymex-2 to cleanse all the dead cells out. All right. In the midst of that, Dakota and I started doing the series on Lyme, and she introduced, which is on her herbal database, the Borrelogen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and that's, I believe, Dr. Harrington's protocol.
Jernigan.
Okay. So when, Dakota, when you brought that up and you started to describe, of course, it was recommended for Lyme, but it also does indicate the Ehrlichea, which was the other tick fever that I had. And so my first thought, and I know a friend of mine, when you described it, and it was like a probiotic that was going to reveal the bacteria that was hidden, which is the typical aspect of the tick fever, is that the bacteria hides. And so then the body doesn't identify it in such a way that then the body knows how to go about its healing and removing the bacteria that isn't necessarily good. So, of course, our immediate thought was, well, wow, this sounds like a great probiotic that we should all be taking.
Okay, hold on a second. It's not a probiotic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's a virus. The bacteriophage is a virus.
It is a virus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so when I consulted with you, we thought, that might not be a bad idea. And this is the thing. Even though I had been given the antibiotic, it was really clear from the research that I did that we don't really know enough about these diseases. We don't know enough about it. And even when I went into the physicians, I was educating them. I realized that. Mm-hmm. And my concern was, well, I went through the 5-day phase, and I had no way of telling whether I had really resolved this or not.
Now, hold on a second. You only took it for 5 days?
No, the antibiotic was 14 days.
Okay, and that's still not long enough according to some doctors, but continue.
Exactly. And this is what brought me to the Borrelogen, is that why I decided to begin doing that supplement is that I realized I don't really know if this has been taken care of in my body. And I didn't want to wait to see if I was going to have reoccurring symptoms. So I felt really confident when I started to do the Borrelogen. I realized I felt confident that something else was still going on in my body, not just building my immune system, but that there was an active supplement in me that was addressing this. And, as some of you may already know, the lab work for these fevers is very high end. And I wasn't really in the position to go back, get those tests again and find out if I still had it or not. And I also questioned whether I was diagnosed correctly, because if you look at the research, some tests will catch it. It may be an off day and it doesn't catch it. Okay? All right, so I had done the research on the Borrelogen, and I thought, no, this makes a lot of sense. On the recommended dosage. It was 20 drops 3 times a day. And Dakota, you had shared, it might be wise to start off slowly. Well, I was so excited about using it. I did it the first day. I went 20 drops. Are you kidding? I want this stuff in me. And I did the 20 drops for the first 2 days. By the second, third day, I had a very powerful experience. And mind you, I was not having any of my reoccurring symptoms that indicated to me that I had tick fever. I had gone through all those cleanses, and I just come to a place where I was building my immune system. I thought, no, this is good. By the second, third day, I had a really interesting experience of, I felt a wave of nausea. And I went, uh-oh, and I was really concerned. And I went, that's familiar again. And so I just kind of got quiet, and I sat with that nausea. And I'm telling you, I was sitting there, it wasn't moments. I felt and saw a burst of light in my body. And then I felt like these arms, I felt like my whole body just reached out and encroached upon it. And the sound when you delete something on a computer, I heard, and I'm telling you, I felt it completely cleared. And the nausea was gone like instantly. And I sat there and I went, oh my gosh. And I just really felt like this Borrelogen had really done its job. It was like I could follow every moment because like I said, I stilled myself to really tune in. So then I thought, oh, I should check the calendar and see if I'm in that 6-week cycle that we talked about.
By the way, it can be 4 weeks.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, it was very close in the proximity. And I went, oh, wow, this is amazing. So it was like I was in the cycle when the symptoms could reoccur. And I thought, oh, this is too perfect, right? And now I'm documenting pretty much every day all my symptoms right now. I am documenting all my supplements, and like I said, I'm still seem to be maintaining a fatigue thread, and I'm watching that. But I'm also doing supplements to boost my immune. And so I've had some real strange things, and I want to come back because even the episode we did on co-infection applies right now. Okay, so that's the second, third day. The next day, sure enough, I get cramping and aching in my belly, and I'm like, oh my gosh, only this time it was a little more severe in the experience. And I was still doing the 20 drops, right? And at that point I went, this is that same symptom. It almost feels like a flu bellyache, right? And I sat back again. I just got still, and sure enough, I could see and experience this burst of light. There was like, it's like a burst of vitality or life from some other source. Boom, it exploded in me. I had that same experience. It went outside my body. It encroached. My body encroached and deleted. And now it's just like, I was in such awe of instantaneous. I did not have to go very long for that to happen. Now, when it happened, I did get concerned because you had said, start lower dose and work up. And I thought maybe I was antagonizing a little too much. Maybe it was too intense. And so after that, I thought, okay, I'm going to reduce the dosage because isn't there that word, Dakota? What was that when you said it's a reoccurrence of symptoms?
Oh, well, Herx isn't necessarily a reoccurrence of the symptoms so much as it's an effect in the body of the die-off. So when it's a good thing and a bad thing. When you have a Herx, it shows that something is being killed off. It's not even necessarily Borrelia. It could be any of these pathogens. But if it happens too fast and overwhelms the body's ability to decontaminate itself with the waste matter, because there's all kinds of chemicals that spill out of their bodies, and it's basically a toxic reaction. And so it feels differently to different people, depending on where it's really happening the most. The aim is to reduce that, and that's why you start with the low doses and build up, so that you're killing them off, but not too much all at once.
Okay, that's what I had become sensitive to, because the two symptoms that I had experienced, they were very extreme, even though they were momentary, but I felt like my body, it was too intense. And so after that, I cut my dosage. Well, first I went right to 5 drops for that 4th, 5th day. I went and then I brought it back up to about 10, which is what I'm still on. However, this is what happened. And there's a couple of things I want to address. I want to address the co-infection and also just what you spoke of, because I think I'm in something right now. And then I'm going to go back to the co-infection. I'm in kind of a period right now where I have a bloatedness, almost as if I'm retaining water. And I'm suspecting that it could be the Borrelogen. Okay, I'm suspecting it, and it does feel like what you just described. I think, again, my body is trying to release. It does feel like, debris or matter that has to get out of my body. Okay, so I'm just tuning into that now. I've had this bloatedness for about 3 to 4 days. I've adjusted everything in the diet. I've even, not eaten all day, just to find out, to identify. So yesterday was the first time I took a full day off from it just to see. But I want to go back to co-infection, because when we did that episode, it alerted me about, let's see, where am I? Because I've got notes. But about 3 weeks ago, you probably even know, there was a lot of dampness in our environment, a lot of rain. I had a reoccurrence of very suppressed breathing, and now I'm saying reoccurrence because earlier in the year, around January, I had you witnessed this. I could barely breathe. I didn't even have the breath to talk. About 3 weeks ago, I re-experienced very labored breathing, and I had this cough that I kept bringing up, phlegm, a very clear phlegm though, but just kept coughing it up and coughing it up. So I started to address myself in the lungs, right? I go for acupuncture, and then I think Doc Kim, no, that was before. Okay, so I go for acupuncture, and I'm getting tested, and I'm being told my lungs are clear. Even when I did my follow-up of that illness in January, I went back for the follow-up end of February. I'm being told my lungs are fine. My lungs are fine. I'm like, so I'm starting to go, what is going on here? And in the acupuncture, one of the things that was picked up was maybe something going on in my kidneys, and that was about the time I was doing. I felt like the cleansing was happening in my body, so it was releasing toxins, right? But again, my lungs were fine, and I'm like, okay, and my liver was fine. I'm like, so I kept being aware of this. I continued to build up my immune system. I had to resort to my inhaler, which I prefer not to use, for my breathing. Mahung was very, very helpful, but it's very difficult to get that now. And so when we did the episode, I started thinking about the co-infection, and I started going back to when I had this serious breathing in January, and I thought, you know what? I went down, I told you, I was sitting in a chair, and in 15 seconds, I collapsed. I mean, it
Mm,
came on with no forewarning. I just
mm,
collapsed. There was something very off about that. There was no indication I was getting ill, and it was obvious that my immune system was already depressed, you
mhm,
know, and so I started connecting the dots. And I started thinking after you and I were talking about that, that I think that was a co-infection
mhm.
because I was already compromised. I think the
Yeah.
fever was already here. It was already suppressing my immune system.
Mhm,
And I think my breathing collapsed on that. But then as I was tested further, I started doing research. And remember, we had all that dampness a couple of weeks ago,
mhm,
all the rain, which is when this got severe for me. There was a lot of connectedness to the spleen,
mhm,
dampness in the spleen
mhm,
would be affecting suppressing my breathing and creating
mhm,
phlegm in my lungs. And that's when I was finally able, you see here again,
mhm,
the medical was diagnosing the lungs and saying they're fine. I'm still coughing and having phlegm.
mhm,
I was able to identify it back to my spleen.
mhm,
And I think what happened was, again, it was close enough to that period where my reoccurring fever, tick fever would happen.
mhm.
And I think, again, that's the area it went to. It was actually affecting my spleen this time, bringing up the coughing and the
Mhm.
suppressed breathing. So that's, to conclude, that's where I thought the coincidence of the co-infection
Okay.
occurred. So now I am continuing on the Borrelogen.
Mhm.
I'm at that place where I'm thinking maybe I have to reduce it again because I can't identify the bloating right now.
Mhm.
Spleen uh, can have symptoms of, I think it's called edema.
Mhm. And if you're referring, one of the things that's confusing to people when they hear the word spleen
Yeah.
is that there's a huge difference between the way spleen or the definition of spleen issues in Western medicine and in Chinese medicine. So which version are you talking about?
Oh, I'm definitely talking about the Chinese version.
Okay, so in the case of the Chinese version, what folks need to understand is that spleen doesn't actually mean spleen. That's their term for the digestive system in general. And so that can be confusing for people. And when you talk about how you're having bloating and stuff, well, that would fit right in with a disorder in the digestive system itself. And of course,
Right.
some of the things, and that can affect different parts of the body for sure. And some of the things to look at there are the possibility of candida issues because of taking antibiotics, and that goes with any of these tick-borne diseases where you're using the antibiotic. You can develop a candida overgrowth, and that can cause issues. And then, of course, the other thing you're talking about, the mold and all that.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really
Yeah.
we didn't really cover this in our last show on the co-infections. We ran out of time. But one of the more common ones that's not recognized is the co-infection with mycoplasms,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a whole other issue. So as far as the digestive thing goes, the one that you're on, the Borrelogen, is aimed primarily for Lyme itself, and it has secondary effects on some other co-infections.
Mm-hmm.
So if there's a concern that Lyme might be involved and just wasn't diagnosed, then it's the Borrelogen that's in the background dealing with that. But if there's other stuff like Candida, then there's other stuff that you need to do in it, obviously in addition to the Borrelogen. And one of the co-infections that we talked about where the light bulbs were going off was Babesia. So, and that's very difficult to diagnose. Did you look into Babesia?
No, I didn't. I have that down in my notes. But just what you're saying, I have been treating myself with probiotics too,
Yeah.
feeling like the gut is out of balance.
Yeah. And I would suggest going into, if you haven't done it already,
Yeah.
go into the database and look into the probiotics, because they're not all equal by any means.
Right.
And there are some very good products and some that basically wasting your money on. Take a look at that. And then also I've broken them down into specific types, like various lactobacillus species, for example, that do different things, and that helps you figure out, well, I have this kind of issue, so these are the species I want to make sure I have in my probiotic. So anyway, that's just a suggestion if you're doing the probiotic, because those things are expensive. You want to make sure that you're getting a good one. And even if you know, some of the really good ones might cost a little bit more, but for a short period of time, it might be helpful, and then you can see if it goes away with the probiotic, then it gives you another clue.
Right. I have been, the past few weeks, I've been doing, well, actually more than a few weeks, a homemade recipe of yogurt, chlorophyll, and fenugreek in a clean water. I let it ferment 3-4 days and before I refrigerate it. And I was doing like half a cup of that.
Okay, well that's good, but I don't think that it's really sufficient if you've got a real what's called a dysbiosis of your microbiome. It's probably not enough.
Do you know anything about the gut shots?
A little bit. Are you doing those?
Yeah, I just got 2 bottles of that, and I started that about 2 days ago.
Okay. Yeah, I have to look more into those and see what's in them. One of the problems that arises with the probiotics is that folks often aren't taking enough of it, and the variety of the species is inadequate in them. Like some of them, you know, might have like 60 billion critters, and you think that's great, but there might be only 12 species, or 8 species, or 6 species, and so the goal is to get something that has, unfortunately, there aren't any of them that have everything that we want. That's why we have to take such good care of our microbiomes, because it's difficult to replace 1,000 species, you know. And it's difficult to know which ones, although there's developing testing now to try to find out what is your actual microbiome.
I think, you know, I think I pretty much shared the symptoms and my experience. I would just say the most important thing is, you know, get more and more knowledgeable about your own body and your own symptoms, and record something that you feel is continuing. Like I'm hearing a lot of people talk about fatigue, and I'm hearing about all kinds of different health issues. Record it so that you can track it.
Yeah.
I think that's been real valuable for me. And of course, the herbal database, you know, I'm in there, and I'm getting some great information.
Okay. All right, my dear. Well, thank you for sharing your experience with us, and I'd love to hear from others that are dealing with this, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
You know, let us know if you would like to share your story, and we'll bring you on.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks, Dakota.
All righty. See you next week.
All right. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye, love.